In Canada, fraud stories are supposed to end in courtrooms, with handcuffs, sentencing hearings, restitution that never truly comes. But some frauds don't end there. Some leave behind something far worse. In the 1990s, thousands of ordinary Canadians believed they had found the perfect investment. A mortgage company that promised stability, security, and returns that felt almost too good to ignore. It was called Aron Mortgage. To many, it looked safe. It sounded respectable. And it sold itself as a bridge between everyday investors and real estate-backed wealth. But beneath the polished promises was a financial machine fueled by deception. New money was used to satisfy old expectations. Paper confidence replaced real collateral. And behind the scenes, the structure was rotting. When it collapsed, the damage was staggering. Retirement funds vanished. Families lost homes. Marriages broke under the pressure. And in one of the darkest twists tied to the aftermath of financial ruin, lives would end in a horrifying murder-suicide. This is the story of Aron Mortgage, the Canadian investment disaster that shattered trust, destroyed futures, and proved that some Ponzi schemes don't just steal money, they steal people's lives.
To understand why Aron Mortgage became such a catastrophe, you first have to understand the illusion it sold. This was not pitched like a casino gamble. It wasn't some shady boiler room penny stock. It wasn't a mysterious offshore account. Aron marketed itself as something ordinary, familiar, respectable. Mortgages. The concept was simple, or at least it seemed simple. Investors were told their money would be placed into mortgages secured by real estate developments. In other words, your money wasn't just invested. It was supposedly backed by actual land, actual projects, actual property. And for everyday Canadians, especially retirees, that sounded safe. Real estate has a psychological power. People may not understand derivatives. They may not trust the stock market. They may not believe in speculative tech. But land, buildings, houses, that feels real. Aron knew that. It leaned hard into the image of stability, a serious business, a tangible asset class, a reliable stream of returns. And in a country where many people were looking for secure ways to grow retirement savings, that pitch was almost irresistible, especially when the returns looked better than a bank. Aron's promises created the perfect emotional trap, higher returns than traditional savings, but wrapped in the language of safety. That combination is deadly, because the moment an investor believes something is both profitable and secure, skepticism starts to die. And once skepticism dies, fraud gets room to breathe. Behind Aron Mortgage were men who understood something very dangerous. Credibility doesn't have to be earned, it only has to be performed. One of the names most associated with the scandal was Michael Rudge, a principal tied to the Aron empire and later one of the faces connected to the collapse. Alongside others in the company's leadership, Aron built an image of professionalism that helped disarm investors. Offices, paperwork, structured offerings, mortgage language. It looked legitimate enough that people stopped asking the most important question in any investment. Where exactly is the money going? That's one of the oldest truths in financial crime. The bigger the fraud, the less it relies on obvious criminal behavior. It relies on atmosphere, the right office, the right terminology, the right confidence, the right social proof. Aron wasn't selling numbers, it was selling trust. And trust is far more valuable than any collateral, because once someone trusts you, they stop investigating you. And once enough people trust you, they recruit others for you. Friends told friends, relatives told relatives, business associates reassured one another. I know someone who invested, they're getting paid, it must be real. That's how these schemes become social epidemics. The fraud doesn't spread through advertising alone.
it spreads through relationships. And in Aaron's case, that made the eventual collapse even more devastating. Because when the money disappeared, people didn't just lose savings, they lost trust in the people who had convinced them to join. The core of a Ponzi scheme is brutally simple. It does not create wealth. It creates the appearance of wealth. New investors put money in, old investors get paid. Those payments create confidence. Confidence attracts more investors. More investors bring more money. And for a while, it looks like a thriving business. According to reporting and later research into the case, Eron Mortgage operated like a classic Ponzi structure, where new investor funds were used to pay earlier investors, even as investors were led to believe they were buying into real mortgage-backed opportunities. That is the genius and horror of these schemes. They often look most convincing right before they collapse, because early on, people really do get paid. That first check, it arrives. That second payment also arrives. Suddenly, the investor becomes a believer. And believers do something powerful. They double down. Some reinvest profits, some increase principal, some borrow against homes, some bring in siblings, parents, church friends, co-workers. The fraud matures not when strangers invest, but when victims become ambassadors. That's exactly why Eron spread so widely. The company didn't need every investor to understand complex mortgage structures. It only needed them to believe one thing: it's working. And because money appeared to be flowing, people assumed the underlying business must be healthy. But in a Ponzi scheme, the visible success is often the proof of the lie. It is the illusion that keeps the machine alive. One of the cruelest myths about fraud is that only foolish people fall for it. That is not true. In fact, some of the most devastating scams trap intelligent, experienced, financially literate people, and Aaron Mortgage is a powerful example of that. Later analysis of the Aaron disaster found something deeply revealing. Many victims were not reckless amateurs. Some were educated, experienced, and believed they understood investing. Some of the investors who considered themselves knowledgeable actually lost even more. Why? Overconfidence, familiarity bias, social proof. If an investment sounds technical enough, respectable enough, and is vouched for by people you trust, your brain starts filling in the missing pieces. It's mortgage-backed, so it must be safer. They've been paying consistently. Other smart people are in. If this were fake, someone would have stopped it. That last one is especially dangerous. People often assume regulators are watching, that if a company is operating publicly enough, it must have passed some invisible test. But fraud often thrives in the gaps between what people assume is regulated and what actually is. By the time many Aaron investors realized the truth, they had already committed far more than they ever intended. Some didn't just invest once, they reinvested again and again. And according to later study, earlier investors often lost more, not less, because they kept adding money over time as their confidence grew. That is one of the most brutal twists of all. The people who trusted the longest often got hurt the worst. Every Ponzi scheme has a breaking point. Sometimes it comes from a regulator, sometimes from a whistleblower, sometimes from simple mathematics. Because no matter how polished the lie is, eventually the money runs out. For Aaron Mortgage, that breaking point came in 1997 when the illusion collapsed. By then, the damage was already enormous. Estimates place investor losses at roughly $240 million, making Aaron one of the most notorious mortgage investment frauds in Canadian history. And unlike a market downturn where values may someday recover, a Ponzi collapse is often terminal. The money isn't temporarily down, it's gone. Gone into payouts, gone into misrepresentations, gone into the machinery of the fraud itself. For investors, the collapse was not just financial, it was psychological whiplash. One day they believed they were secure, the next they were staring into a void. Retirement plans evaporated. Education funds vanished. Families suddenly discovered that decades of discipline had been wiped out by someone else's deception. Some victims had invested conservatively their entire lives, only to lose everything in the one place they thought was safe. That is what makes fraud so uniquely traumatic. A bad business decision hurts, a market crash hurts, but fraud adds humiliation, shame, betrayal, self-blame. Victims don't just ask, "How much did I lose?" They ask, "How did I let this happen?" And for some, that question becomes unbearable. Financial crime is often reported in numbers. Millions lost, thousands affected, years in prison. But numbers hide suffering. Aaron's victims were not statistics. They were retirees, parents, professionals, small business owners, families who thought they were being responsible. Some had spent 30 or 40 years building the money they put into Aaron. Some believed they were protecting their future. Instead, they walked into a trap. Later victim accounts revealed deep emotional scars, embarrassment, grief, rage, and the sense that entire life plans had been stolen. The harm wasn't just financial, it reshaped relationships, retirement, and mental health. Imagine explaining to your spouse that the money is gone. Imagine telling your children that their inheritance disappeared. Imagine realizing the home you refinanced, the line of credit you opened, the trust you placed in someone was all built on a lie. Some people recovered slowly, some never did. And in the wreckage of massive financial fraud, a darker pattern often emerges. Despair turns inward or outward. That's the part of the story the journalists rarely dwell on, because while journalists report the collapse, families live with the aftershock for years. And in at least one horrifying case tied to financial devastation and emotional ruin, the aftermath would end in blood. When money disappears, the public sees loss. But inside homes, loss can mutate into something far more dangerous: pressure, blame, fear, shame. The collapse of a major fraud like Etron didn't just bankrupt portfolios. It destabilized marriages, identities, and entire family systems. For some victims, the emotional burden became catastrophic, and in the shadow of that ruin, one of the most horrifying outcomes associated with financial collapse emerged: a murder-suicide that transformed a fraud story into a human tragedy of the darkest kind. This is where the narrative changes, because now we are no longer talking only about white-collar crime. We are talking about the way financial destruction can trigger total personal collapse. A person who believes they have failed their family, who sees no path out, who cannot face the shame, the debt, the consequences, can become deeply unpredictable. In some cases, that desperation becomes self-destruction. In the worst cases, it becomes familicide. The murder-suicide tied to the emotional fallout of financial devastation remains one of the most chilling reminders that fraud is not a victimless paper crime. It can reach into kitchens, bedrooms, living rooms. It can turn private despair into irreversible violence. And when that happens, the fraud is no longer just about money stolen. It becomes a chain reaction of human collapse. A fraud can end in bankruptcy, or it can end in a body bag, and that is what makes this story unforgettable. In the aftermath, investigators and courts worked through the wreckage. Etron became a landmark case in Canadian fraud history, not only because of the money lost, but because of how completely trust had been weaponized. The story of Aaron Mortgage is not just about money. It's about what happens when trust is turned into a weapon. It's about how a polished lie can destroy careful people. It's about how financial crime can quietly invade ordinary lives and leave behind extraordinary devastation. And in the darkest corner of that devastation, it can end in violence, murder, suicide, families shattered forever. The next time someone tells you an investment is safe because it's backed by something real, remember this case. Because sometimes the most dangerous scams are not the ones that look reckless, they are the ones that look responsible. This was Iran Mortgage, the Canadian Ponzi disaster that didn't just steal millions, it stole futures, it stole trust, and for some, it stole life itself. If you want more dark, deeply researched true crime and financial crime stories, subscribe now and comment below. Should white-collar criminals face harsher punishments when lives are destroyed? I'll see you in the next one.